Unique people leading unique lives shape and inform Iowa City. This community is enhanced by these women and men who live in our midst, working, teaching, creating. Welcome to a series of conversations with people who have stories to tell. Join my special guests and me, Ellen Buchanan, in a series of interviews called One of a Kind. John Ebert, the founder of the Iowa Mountaineers, always had a strong urge to go places and do things outdoors. From Kilimanjaro in East Africa to summits in Peru to the Matterhorn in Switzerland, John, with his wife Edie, led adventuresome climbers to some of the world's most challenging and spectacular peaks. The Iowa Mountaineers made first ascents and found new routes in the Canadian Rockies, Alaska, Peru, East Africa, New Zealand, and western United States. They even named mountains. In the Sawtooth in Idaho, visitors today find Mount Hansher, named after Virgil Hansher, Mount Ebert, and Mount Edie. Besides rock climbing and mountaineering and presenting travelogues and teaching a U of I men's physical education course entitled Outings and Mountaineering, another part of John Ebert's story is radio. He worked at WSUI from 1931 until 1975. Serving as chief engineer, John broadcast university ball games, classes, and even graduation ceremonies. He later hosted programs on outdoor excursions called The Woodland Rambler and Vacation Adventuring. A major part of his story is his wife, Edie. They met in the mid-30s when Edie was a nursing student at the University of Iowa. She traveled with him, climbed mountains, and helped with tour details and secretarial needs. John and Edie raised 3 sons in Iowa City, John, Jim, and Joel, and they have 8 grandchildren. Thank you for being my guest on One of a Kind. I know your story begins in Richmond, Wisconsin, where you were born in 1907. I want to know, when did this passion, which indeed it is, of travel and adventure maybe hit you? Was it as a child or high school?
Well, to tell you the truth, it started before I knew it started. In other words, I had always had a feeling that I'm missing something. I mean, I ought to be going someplace, I ought to be doing something other than what I was really doing. Mm-hmm. But I didn't really know what it was until I read a couple books. A book by a Swiss mountain climber. And in his book, he philosophized how the mountains and the great outdoors could affect a person's life. Mm-hmm. And after reading the book, I said, well, now how can I do something like that in Iowa? Goodness, I couldn't do that here. And I didn't do much about it until I was in the last year of grade school. And the teacher said, we're going to have each of you write up a paper. I think they said it was supposed to be about 500 words about what you'd like to do and why. And in that, I started to think deeper. In other words, I was going, well, now, that's a good question. That's a really good question. And just about that time, our government passed a law that all ships had to have radio communication because of in case of accidents. And there were no operators. I mean, they were at a low point, probably not more than one person to operate the equipment out of 10. So they had the trade schools start. And these trade schools made me think, well, now when I get done with my basic education, I'm going to go to work and take a course from a trade school and see if I can get a job on a boat and go around the world and so forth. And by the time I actually finished my college education and so forth, I found that the job on a boat was not any longer as romantic as it sounded when these different magazines had big ads, you know, be a ship operator, go see the world. And so then I said, well, now what am I going to do? And then I said, well, I think I'll probably start out by getting a job in a land radio station. And the very first place I went, because of the school I went to, had a list of people that want to have jobs and so forth. And they had me down, and so I interviewed Carl Menzer.
At the University of Iowa.
At the University of Iowa. And he was impressed with my viewpoints and so forth, and my outlook on life. And I in turn let him know that I had this restless roaming fever of wanting to see other parts of the world and all that. And I didn't want to be tied down completely, so I could never do that. So I inquired right at the beginning, what's the chances of getting leave of absence on occasion? And he said, well, he said, you have to put in your hours and so forth, but I'll be sympathetic to helping you out. And then he said, by the way, what do you have in mind? And I said, well, the far corners of the world. As far as possible. I mean, I don't imagine I can do it, but I'm going to try, and I might want to have you help me go places. And well, he didn't promise me anything, but he said, well, if you want the job, as soon as the Board of Regents approve it, you have it. So I had 2 years in order to do whatever I wanted to. And it was just wonderful. I mean, I had usually 2 months off in summertime, without pay, of course. And I could dream of all kinds of romantic places to go. And then I also met my wife.
Edie.
Edie.
She was a nursing student.
She was a nursing student. And
how did you meet her?
Well,
John?
You won't believe it.
Oh, yes, I will.
I was going across the bridge, Iowa Avenue Bridge, and I was going towards the hospital. My wife was coming to classes in the morning, and I saw her across the street. I was going this way, she was going that way. And I said, I wonder how I can get to know that girl. And at that time, I was staying in the quadrangle dormitory. And I mentioned this to my roommate, and I said, you know, there's a girl that goes across the Iowa Avenue Bridge. I've seen her 3 times now, and I'd like to meet her. Well, how do I go about this? And he said, well, he says, I know her quite well. And I said, well, have you dated her and so forth? She said, no, but I tried to.
You are really determined. You saw her, and you were going to meet her, and you did.
Right.
So did he line you up with her?
Oh, no, no. When I had the name, I called her up on the telephone. And I explained that she never met me and so forth, but I saw her go across the bridge. She thought I was a nut.
but not really, because how many years later, how many years have you two been married? Quite a few, haven't you?
Well, we've been married now for 53 years.
53 years. Well, you're a good picker, I think.
Well, she had never seen a mountain before.
Isn't that something?
Now
I want to, before we get into the mountain, because there's so many stories of the Iowa Mountaineers. So when you were working for WSUI, you were broadcasting classes and...
Besides operating WSUI, and I had a few students helping me occasionally, because I couldn't be 10 places at once. But when I could, I would do various other things, and one of the things was announcing for classrooms, because I never figured that I was really a speech major and so forth, but I had the will, and I knew what I wanted to do, and I had the enthusiasm, and so all I had to do was work that into my lifestyle. And
now, okay, let's get into the Mountaineers. How did this begin? What was your how did you gather all these people in Iowa to gather for the purpose of exploring the thought of maybe climbing mountains or rock climbing?
Well, 3 years before the Iowa Mountaineers were founded, I went on a trip out west with a local photographer, Reuben Scharf, and a university photographer, Gordon Kent.
That was Mr. Kent's brother?
Right.
The Kent that people know in town, the birder?
Right.
Okay.
Right. And I had difficulty finding roommates because at that time my wife was in nursing school, and so she couldn't get off. And I had a heck of a time getting somebody to go with me. But I finally talked Gordon Kent and Reuben Sharp to go with me. And of course, because they were both photographers, my interests and their interests were far apart. I mean, so far apart that there were times when I couldn't do what I wanted to do at all because they had me outnumbered 2-1, you know. But they knew I was a pretty good photographer because they always developed my film. Mm-hmm. And they said, John, why don't you go to work and try to get into a professional line. I'll show you how to take movies and so forth. And I've heard about travelogues. And I think that you'd make a good travelogue photographer. Mm-hmm. And of course, I thought he was kidding. I didn't know anything. And when we got back to Iowa, they took me out on a weekend and showed me how to operate a movie camera and explained the real essentials of it. And I shot a 100-foot roll, and they looked at it and they said, you're catching on quick. Why don't you consider that? So I said, well, I'll shoot some film and see what you think. Mm-hmm. And they said, John, you have the knack, which is hard to teach. And try it. You have nothing to lose. And so that's how it really started.
So it was started out, Iowa Mountaineers, as a University of Iowa student organization, correct?
Right.
And then you learned kind of the tricks of the trade in the summers when you would go visit national parks, and is that correct? How did you learn yourself to mountain climb and rock climb? Who taught you?
Well, the first thing I did, I went to the libraries, including the Iowa City Library. I didn't find anything there, but I looked there for books on mountaineering, especially books by famous climbers and so forth. And some of these early climbers, they really went in considerable detail about climbing, how you do this and how you do that. Well, first of all, that type of training is not good in the mountains, but it gives you an idea what the essentials are, kind of, because they say, well, do this, do that. They have diagrams there about how to tie knots, techniques of how to rappel, how to belay, and all that. And then I would go out with climbers that were much better than I, especially some friends from Chicago, who didn't belong to any club at the time, but they'd go out climbing almost every weekend, see. And so
climbing where in the Midwest?
At the Mississippi Palisades State Park and at Devils Lake, Wisconsin. And Devils Lake, Wisconsin is really one of the very best climbing areas for training in the whole country. I mean, it's amazing.
What makes it that? What makes it so special?
It's beautiful. They have a lake in the middle, and they have trails all the way around. One at the base of the rocks, and one at the top. So as you go up these rocks, you can go to work and take the upper trail to the upper point, and then climb, or you can go to the top, climb to the top, and then rappel down and so forth. But in all, the rock is so hard, and it's mostly schist and granite, which means that it's very safe. And the rock walls go up as much as 100 feet, 125 feet, so that it's really, with the beautiful views and all that, is an ideal area to take climbers.
So what was your first mountain that you led people up after you trained and learned and found out what it was like and climbed yourself? Do you remember your first expedition, where it was?
Oh yes, it was in the Northern Wind Rivers. And
in Idaho?
No, this is in Wyoming.
Oh, in Wyoming, okay.
And it has some very, very good peaks there, going up to around, well, the highest peak in Wyoming is in the Northern Wind Rivers.
Did you scale or did you go on trails?
No, it was at Devil's Lake that we went by trails and so forth. In the mountains, we usually did climbing from the bottom up to the top. Mm-hmm. And we showed them how to belay and so forth. Mm-hmm. And we went over all the fundamentals on our weekend outings. In other words, our weekend outings were mostly for training.
Which is very important, so they know all the techniques.
That's right. And then when we went in the mountains, we actually started to climb right away. But we applied and we stressed all these safety factors.
And you have an enviable safety record. You've never had and how many climbs you've never had a major accident or lost a life, is that correct?
That's correct.
And how many climbs would you say that is? How many expeditions? About?
Well, I went on an outing every year for up to now 52 years. And sometimes I went on two mountain climbing outings in a year. So I had, you might say, at each outing I climbed 5 or 6 or 7 mountains. So when you figure that out, why, and a number of people we took, we probably had somewhere around several thousand people that went with us. The fact is, a lot of the people never heard of the mountains, and they didn't know that they even wanted to climb. We broke them. We talked them into wanting to climb.
They wanted to sign up and do it.
Right. And we were very careful. In other words, we knew that as a university organization, one fatality and we were out.
Mm-hmm. What do you attribute your safety record to?
Well, first of all, before you do anything, you use your eyes. You have to know what you're getting into. Mm-hmm. And so that you have to figure out what you want to do, what mountain you want to climb, look it over to see whether the route that you're capable of making is on the side you want to go up or not. In other words, a mountain has routes where you can go up on all sides. Some are not safe. So you shouldn't try it. Some of your members, if they're very expert and know certain techniques very well, you can go up fairly difficult peaks. But if you have beginners like that, then what you do is you go the easiest route and one that you feel the people can handle. Mm-hmm. And you can see that in just a few minutes. Well, once you start out, in 5-10 minutes, you know whether they know how to walk, mm-hmm. you know whether they know how to handle themselves.
You must have very good judgment, John.
Well,
would you say that's one of your strengths?
Yes.
You have good common sense?
Good common sense. Back off when you know it shouldn't be done. Mm-hmm. And above all, don't let anybody persuade you to do something you don't want to do. That's critical. You have to use your own judgment and,
because would your people
and trust you and judge you.
Would your participants try and push you to keep going when you knew that perhaps you needed to turn around? And
many times. The fact is, I've lost a few friends that way because when I felt something wasn't safe, my decision was final. There's no argument about it.
They call it the buck stops at you.
Right.
Tell me about this one Devil's Tower that you touched on briefly.
At that early time, most of the climbing we did, a lot of the training we did was at the Devil's Lake State Park. And at Devil's Lake State Park, there were these walls. A lot of them had roots that went up as much as 125, 150 feet. And so, because I was able to scale those and so forth, I figured, well, Devil's Tower consists of a series of ledges. And so that actually, if we do it right, all Devil's Tower is a series of ledges. So we go from one 100-foot stretch up to the next 100-foot stretch and so forth until finally we get to the top. So I figured, well, I'm not taking any chances. Really, this is what we do whenever we go to Devil's Lake. We climb almost the same thing, only at the Devil's Tower. You have to go in stages until you get to the top. So I said, well, I'm going to take a group up that mountain, up that tower. And
nobody ever had done it before.
Oh yes, but they were really experts, and there were only 1 or 2 to the party.
And this was how many in your group?
We had 17, including one woman. And so we told the members we were going to take up not to tell anybody. I didn't want any publicity at all, nothing at all. But it gets, you know how it gets out. And so the National Park got involved and said, we hear that you're going to go up Devil's Tower. We will not allow that, and so forth. And I said, well, that's another problem I have to solve. And I wrote to the, maybe 15 or 16 very influential people, the best climbers and so forth, geologists and other people who I thought could give me a letter of recommendation that I had good judgment, that was it, the judgment part. And based upon that, they said, well, you can do it, but be very, very careful. And we're not going to advertise it. And I said, oh, that's wonderful. I don't want it advertised. But when we got there, the evening before we were going to go up the tower, they were hundreds of people all around, milling all around, waiting for us to climb the next day. And probably the thing that really teed us off, they had helicopters and airplanes flying over there until after dark, seeing those crazy islands on top of the tower. And they yelled down to us, see? And some of our members started yelling back.
So much for pristine wilderness.
And then the next morning, they had brought along their sleeping bags and so forth. They laid at the bottom of the tower with their sleeping bag and their pillows, and then just watched us climb. The funny thing about that is that...
That was in 1948, right?
1948.
48,
the funny thing about that also is that the next day, some of our members, when they saw those people lying in the grass down below, made some remarks which, because of the resonating property of the rock, was very audible down below. And some of the first remarks were, look at those crazy people down there.
From Iowa.
Right.
I love it. Tell me, did you screen your participants so that the chemistry would be right in these...
They had to fill out a very complicated questionnaire, and they had to list what they had done, the most difficult things that they had done, whether they really knew how to belay and repel. That was critical. And other things like along that line. And they all agreed to it, but then when we got them out there, we checked on it, see.
Did you ever send anybody home?
Not from Devil's Tower.
Not from Devil's, but the other mountain expeditions.
Yes. Well, sending them home sounds kind of brutal. What we try to do is persuade them to do something else in the area.
Okay. Tell me, of all the places that you've been, Africa, Peru, and Switzerland, and New Zealand, is there a place that's very, very special to your heart that you thought was just quite wondrous?
Well...
Or is it hard to pick a
It's
favorite?
almost impossible. And the reason I say that is, first of all, the Swiss Alps. Everybody has probably heard of them, especially if you're a mountain climber. And they're beautiful and so forth. They have all the different types of folklore there, the people and so forth. Then they have Peru. And most people don't even know what Peru is. But it is one of the most beautiful mountainous countries in the world. And I can leave my home in Iowa City today and fly to Miami by middle afternoon, be in Miami by midnight, and the next day I can be at the foot of a 22,000-foot mountain. Beautiful mountain. There's a picture in there of it.
Good.
Beautiful mountain. And it gets in your bones and so forth. And the people are so friendly.
In Peru?
Oh, yes, they're so friendly. We love it. But for the last 3 years, we could not climb the mountain or go to Peru because of the political situation.
Where are the Iowa Mountaineers? I know your son is leading them now. Where are they off to these days?
Well, this summer they're going to be in Colorado. They're going to be in Wyoming. They're going to have two or three outings to Grand Canyon and other areas there, so that they have a fairly full schedule.
Full schedule. And now, in your past, the 50 years of marrying your wife, Edie, you mentioned that she had never climbed a mountain before she met you,
Right.
and that she went on most of your climbs except when she was pregnant. Is that right?
That's right.
I want to read the most wonderful journal entry of your wife, Edie, which I think tells a lot about you and a lot about her. It's a very short one, but I thought it was so funny and so wonderful. She wrote, "The summer of 1941, I found my long-cherished desire for adventure partially fulfilled. I wanted to travel and visit out-of-the-way places, but I didn't bargain on the thrills, chills, and spills my husband so thoughtfully drummed up for me. Very early one morning, John decided to take me up the 2,000-foot west wall of the canyon. It was dark when we started, and my composure remained in the dark most of the day. We reached the top of the wall without mishap. We found shelter behind a huge boulder, and I had the dubious pleasure of eating with half-frozen fingers when John spied a peak just ahead. I was satisfied," Edie wrote, "with the day's accomplishment, but John had different ideas. 2 hours later, we were on the neighboring summit, and I was using all fours to convince the wind that I wanted to remain there." Do you remember that climb?
No, I don't forget it.
She must be a wonderful sport. And
She really is. She never complains. There are times when I think I started to complain almost, and she would sing and so forth, and just be a wonderful person.
what a wonderful combination for a trip with a leader and the wife to do this. I read that there were some romances that happened and subsequent marriages from your participants.
Well, at the time we stopped counting, which is about 8 years ago, as far as we could tell, we had 630 occasions where they met for the first time and were married.
And did some people get married on the mountain too, that they had climbed?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, last year, my son had an outing in Devil's Tower in Wyoming. And among one of his climbing leaders was a gentleman who had just planned to get married. And my son and this couple decided that they'd like to get married on top of Devil's Tower, which they did. She had a wedding gown and everything, and it was really romantic. And they had a minister up there who had never climbed before.
I hope he didn't suffer from acrophobia.
I doubt it.
Oh, that's wonderful. What did all of these climbing expeditions teach you about yourself?
First of all, be honest. Evaluate what you want to do, and don't go over the bounds of that, because if you can't trust your own judgment, you have nothing to go by to indicate what you should or can't do. You only have your judgment, and you have to trust that. And if you trust that, and you use common sense, so that you don't try to do something that you shouldn't be doing in the first place, mountain climbing can be a very safe sport. There's only been about once or twice where I've ever slipped, and I had to use the rope as a safeguard. And most of the time, luckily at that time, I used the rope. Most of the time, I don't climb on that rope. I mean,
But that time you had a rope on.
Right.
Was your wife along on that trip? That you slipped and dangled off on a rope?
Yeah, I think by golly, I think she did, and she bawled me out.
She bawled you out.
Right. John, you know better.
Yeah. There's so many things I wanted to ask, but the one I didn't want to miss. The question was about. I think I know the answer, but who in your life has really had a big influence on you?
First of all, I must give credit to, not the main one probably, but give credit to Carl Minzer for allowing me to have time off and so forth, because at one time somebody said that I had asked for more leave of absence than anybody else had ever attended the university. I don't know. I know I had difficulty at times getting off, and I had to go up the ladder about getting permission and so forth. But I usually, on my foreign expeditions, I usually had an objective which played right into what a university should do. Mm-hmm. In other words, a university sometimes should be more than just a university in a building. Sure. in one location. And so that I felt that I could bring out some of these points to add extra pressure to have the university approve my mm-hmm. thing. But I would say that Reuben Scharf and Gordon Kent helped me tremendously, because I couldn't become a good photographer without the help of people that knew more about it than I did. Mm-hmm. And I depended upon them to advise me, and they did. They told me, they analyzed my pictures and say, that's wrong, don't do that, mm-hmm. John. And of course, I can't forget my wife. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Because without her, I couldn't have gone, because
I had that feeling that reading about you and talking to you, that she has played a big part in your life. Right. And you have 3 children, and just quickly tell me where they are.
My oldest son is in Little Falls, Minnesota. My middle-aged son is in Iowa City, and the youngest one is in Salt Lake City, Utah.
Well, I know our viewers are going to really have a treat seeing your photographs that will be edited in this interview, and I thank you, John Ebert, for being my guest. My guest on One of a Kind has been John Ebert. For most of John's life, his energies and interests have centered on travel and adventure. He's the founder of the Iowa Mountaineers, which is an Iowa City-based organization which engages in training, rock climbing, and mountain climbing expeditions. Beginning in 1940 as a U of I student organization, the flag of the Iowa Mountaineers has been raised upon the summits of some of the world's highest mountains. They've climbed in Africa, New Zealand, Alaska, Switzerland, South America, Western United States, and other areas. John Ebert, a native of Wisconsin, came to the Iowa City area in the early 1930s as chief engineer of WSUI, the university radio station. He and his wife Edie shared the love of travel and climbing. She joined him on expeditions, helped with tour details, assisted with his travelogues, and served as his secretary. Adventurer, courageous outdoorsman, sports enthusiast, radio engineer, and devoted husband, all describe John Ebert. He is one of a kind.